Welcome. I am delighted to see how many of you are joining us from all corners of the world. First things first, this webinar is available in American Sign Language, Arabic, English, French, and Spanish. Please go to the interpretation button, which is at the bottom of your screen, to select your preferred language. And it's important to note, if you are an English speaker, you may be hearing me speak in English, but you must still go and select English so that you can hear when we have, for example, Spanish interpretation into English. So if everybody can take a moment to go to the bottom of their screen and select the language. For some strange reason, Zoom only gives us the option for Korean, and the Korean channel is the one for Arabic. So I promise you, we're not going to force you to be Korean speakers, but that is the channel for Arabic. And if you are using the American Sign Language interpretation, please pin the video on your screen. So aside from the speakers, everyone's video and audio has been muted. If you have any technical issues, which we are all familiar with, please try restarting your Zoom. Finally, please note that we are recording this webinar. It will be shared with everyone who registered with the event and for others who request it. So please be aware of that. All right, so we have an exciting lineup. Let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I would like each of you to take a moment and to think of a young child in your life, someone you love. Imagine that child growing up, applying for and beginning their first job. Imagine that young person, whether a teacher, doctor, nurse, domestic worker, journalist, or office worker, beginning her job in an environment where sexual harassment is unheard of, and that in rare instances where gender-based violence occurs, the worker feels supported to speak up, knows where to get help, and gets that help. Imagine that there is timely and appropriate punishment for the perpetrator. Imagine that workers, employers, and governments commit to create a culture of dignity and respect for the precious young person that you are thinking of and for every individual. Thank you for making a choice to join us today for a conversation among truly incredible leaders who are pushing strategically, passionately, and effectively for change so we can push that vision towards reality. My name is Nisha Varia. I am the Women's Rights Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch, and I'd like to thank and highlight our co-sponsors for this event, including ABAD, the Global 16 Days Campaign, the International Domestic Workers Federation, and the International Trade Union Confederation. Today, we will discuss a landmark global treaty, the ILO Violence and Harassment Convention, also known as C190, in the context of global Me Too movements. Our speakers will highlight examples of campaigns, successes, and challenges, and how groups are using the ILO Violence and Harassment Convention to leverage lasting change. Our event today includes a moderated conversation with the screen. Please note that you are welcome to post questions in the online chat at any time. We have online chat moderators who will direct some of these questions to our speakers, who will then also respond in the chat. We also have some time at the end for a Q&A. So without further ado, let's begin. First up, we have Manuela Tomé, the Director of Conditions of Work and Employment at the International Labor Organization, or ILO. Manuela, could you please set the stage for us? What is the ILO Violence and Harassment Convention? Why was it needed? And could you provide us with some highlights of its legal advances?
Good afternoon, everyone from Geneva. Thank you, Nisha, and thank you very much to you and all the organizers for inviting me to this webinar. I really look forward towards today's exchange of experiences and ideas for future action. Perhaps a few words about the ILO for those who may not know it. The ILO is a UN specialized agency that promotes social justice by trying to make work decent for all. And to this end, it adopts international labor standards. A distinct feature of the organization is its tripartite nature, which means that all decisions, including on labor standards, are taken by governments as well as workers and employers organizations. Discussions in the ILO on the need or desirability of new standards on the issue of violence and harassment in the world of work began well before the Me Too movement. However, this movement, as well as several others, gave further impetus and legitimacy to the ILO standard setting process. The ILO's constituents concurred that violence and harassment was a universal and persistent problem, which was affecting disproportionately women and girls, and that it was also a moving target. Changes in the organization of work, including stemming from technological advances, had brought new opportunities, but also new challenges, such as, for instance, violence and harassment arising through cyberbullying. So the ILO's constituents agreed that the existing international labor standards were patchy. They dealt with violence and harassment in the world of work in a rather fragmented manner. We had standards dealing, for instance, with domestic workers, in which there is a provision which specifically deals with violence and harassment against domestic workers and how to protect them from it. But we were lacking an international treaty that would indeed define what violence and harassment in the world of work is all about and provide a clear and comprehensive framework for action. So what's new and groundbreaking about Convention 190, which was adopted in June 2019? For the first time, an international treaty recognized the right to a world of work free from violence and harassment, not for some, but for everyone. It defines what work-related violence and harassment is. It encompasses, open quotes, a range of unacceptable behaviors and practices that aim at, result in, or are likely to result in physical, psychological, sexual, or economic harm, close quotes. While the convention covers all forms of violence and harassment, it singles out gender-based violence, including sexual harassment, as one such form, which disproportionately affects girls and women. The convention provides for a very broad coverage. It applies to the public and private sectors, the formal and informal economy, whether in urban or rural settings. It does not protect only employees, but all those who work, regardless of their contractual status. This means self-employed are also covered, as well as persons in training, such as interns, apprentices, volunteers, and managers, as well as third parties, such as students, clients, or patients who can be either the source of violence and harassment or the target of violence and harassment in the world of work. It covers also violence and harassment that may arise in physical workplace, including homes, where they are a work of place. And I'm thinking in particular of domestic workers that work in the employers' homes, or home-based workers or teleworkers that work from home. It covers, as I was saying, violence and harassment that may also occur when workers are taking their meal during work-related travel, during training, or when commuting to and from work, or in employer-provided accommodation. The convention also covers instances of cyberbullying which are on the rise. Convention 190 also recognizes that domestic violence has an impact in the world of work and requires member states to recognize the effect of domestic violence in the workplace and mitigate them. And the recommendation which accompanies the convention and provides detailed guidance on how to give practical effect to the international treaty put forward measures such as leave for victims, temporary protection against dismissal, or the inclusion of domestic violence in workplace risk assessment. These provisions are particularly relevant in the light of today's circumstances, with millions of people shifting overnight to mandatory teleworking. Many women with abusive partners have been facing an increased risk of domestic violence while working. The convention finally sets a global framework for action and calls for a comprehensive, inclusive, and gender-responsive approach that combines prevention and protection, enforcement and remedies, as well as guidance and training. Of course, for the convention to be able to deliver on its promises, there is a need for many countries to ratify it. For the time being, 2 countries, Uruguay and Fiji, have ratified it. And we are hoping that many others will follow suit. It's clear that the pandemic has somehow slowed down national processes for obtaining the internal authorization to ratify the Convention 190. But it's also true that the pandemic has indeed revealed even further the absolutely relevance and timeliness of this international treaty. So we really very much thank the organizers of this webinar, because we believe that this is a very important means whereby we can try to reach out to a large number of people and groups that are interested in making the world of work and the world in general free from violence and harassment. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manuela. Let's turn now to Delphine O, Ambassador at Large and Secretary General for the Generation Equality Forum, joining us from France. Can you explain to us what the Generation Equality Forum is, and how and why will you be promoting the ILO Violence and Harassment Convention among the stakeholders?
Thank you very much, Nisha. Thank you to Human Rights Watch and its partners for taking the initiative of this very important webinar and of the campaign that will follow. We're very happy, both in France and within the Generation Equality Forum, that there's such interest in the Convention 190 ratification. A few words about the Generation Equality Forum for those of you who are not familiar with it. The Generation Equality Forum is convened by UN Women. It's co-hosted and co-chaired by the governments of France and Mexico. It will be the largest and most important international gathering for women's rights and for gender equality since 1995 and the Beijing Conference. It was scheduled to be taking place this year, both in Mexico and then in Paris in the spring and in the summer. But unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we had to postpone the conference, which will take place in March of next year in Mexico and in early June of next year in Paris. Why is it important? Well, simply because it is, as I said, a historical moment. We haven't had a UN-led World Conference on Women for the past 25 years, which is in by itself ununderstandable, if I may say. It's also quite unique in nature and in format. Unlike what happened 25 years ago and what happened previously with UN-led conferences, we have decided from the very onset of the governance of this forum to include civil society. And so we have set in place a governance structure that is very inclusive and democratic, and that has civil society representatives on its board, from feminist organizations, from grassroots organizations, from NGO, from human rights organizations, also from the private sector, which is also involved in the convention. Second, we have decided on 6 areas of focus for Generation Equality Forum, 6 priorities. one of which is gender-based violence. And so around these 6 areas of priorities, we have formed action coalitions. These coalitions are coalitions of different stakeholders. They gather together governments, multilateral agencies, but also civil society organizations, private sector companies, philanthropic foundations, and so on, that come together and have as a mandate to design a roadmap of action for the next 5 years. So when they come to Paris in June 2021, they will present a very concrete roadmap with concrete actions to be funded and to be implemented in the next 5 years to combat gender-based violence. And we strongly believe that the ratification and the implementation of Convention 190 also is part of the agenda for combating gender-based violence in the next 5 years. So this is why we'd like to use the Generation Equality Forum, which is not only focusing on gender-based violence, but very strongly promotes the fight against gender-based violence as a platform, as an international platform to promote the convention and its ratification. Now, as Director Tomei from ILO has said before, unfortunately, the pandemic has delayed and postponed the ratification process in many countries. And the legislative agenda is in many ways sometimes very busy, but we do hope, and I will talk about this later on in the webinar, to be as France and as the Generation Equality Forum, leading also collaborating on a campaign to encourage other countries, other member states to ratify the convention, so that there will be sort of a rendezvous for everybody in the Generation Equality Forum in June in Paris of next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's really exciting to hear about, and I think we're all ready to get mobilized. Our next speaker is Marie Clark Walker, Chair of the Women's Committee for the International Trade Union Confederation and Secretary-Treasurer of the Canadian Labour Congress. So trade unions have been working really hard to promote the convention. Can you highlight examples of education, mobilization, and reforms that are taking place?
Thank you for the question, Nisha, and thank you and Human Rights Watch for a very, very timely webinar, especially since we see lockdowns coming back. So I think that this is really important right now. The successful negotiation and adoption of ILO Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 were the result of years of sustained campaigning by the global trade union movement. More specifically, women of the movement pushed hard for a strong focus on gender-based violence. And I have to say, it wasn't just women of the movement, but also women in the formal economy who took a huge chance on pushing this forward and were very instrumental in the adoption of this as well. So once we accomplished all of this, we pivoted to focus on securing ratification of the new convention and its effective implementation. The International Trade Union Confederation's hashtag Ratify C190 campaign was being developed and executed in close cooperation with the global union federations and supported by growing numbers of women's rights and feminist organizations and movements, including many organizations that are participating in today's webinar. Today, unions in dozens of countries across the world have lobby and advocacy campaigns in place. And we are ramping up efforts during the 16 days campaign, which begins on November 25th. While celebrating the first 2 ratifications of C190 by Fiji and Uruguay, as was already mentioned by Manuela, back in June of 2020, June of this year, unions in dozens of countries across the world have solid lobby and advocacy campaigns that are currently in place. And these initiated ratification processes in countries like Argentina and Italy. Argentina voted last week. So now we're just waiting for the depositing of the convention in Geneva, and Italy is almost there. So, you know, we have a growing number of governments that are committed to ratifying C190, including South Africa, Namibia, Ireland, Spain, and the Netherlands. Some other countries, such as the Philippines, committed to meetings with representatives from the Ministry of Labor and legislators with a view to ratify C190. Others, like Ukraine, committed to consultations with their government and employers around ratification of the convention. In Canada, where I am, while our government has signaled its intention to ratify the convention relatively early, the agreement of all of our provinces and territories are needed. And that's why C190 was one of the Canadian Labour Congress's annual lobby priorities during our lobbying session last year with Parliament. We also launched an active letter writing and public awareness initiative campaign through our hashtag Done Waiting campaign, a campaign that looks at economic justice for women, where we push on fair work, childcare, pay equity, and violence and harassment. Definitely the COVID-19 pandemic caused frontline workers to experience increased rates of violence and harassment in the workplace. And as Manuela has already indicated, incidences of domestic violence also went up. And so we needed to ramp up our pressure on governments immediately to ratify C190. We also continue to provide education and training around the importance of the International Labor Organization in shaping a world free from violence and harassment, which includes gender-based violence. For instance, global and regional national webinars tell workers' stories of how incorporating C190 and Recommendation 206 provisions in workplace policies, collective bargaining agreements, and law reforms can help build change. Unions have helped to form coalitions to build critical support and shift government positions towards ratification of C190. In Indonesia, for example, the ITUC affiliates formed an alliance of 40 partners to engage in social dialogue with the government and employers to build support for the ratification of C190. Some unions undertook a wide range of other activities, including public petitions in support of the ratification, like in Australia and in France. Others combined the use of social media and traditional media to share key messages and engage their audiences in ratification campaigns, which in some countries led to the public and stakeholders calling on governments to ratify. Countries like Honduras, Peru, Nigeria, Spain, and Morocco. But we aren't waiting for governments to act. Many unions are already bargaining strong anti-harassment language in our collective agreements, strengthening workplace policies, and working with allies to reform employment and labor legislation. Some of us began this work long before the convention was even negotiated. And in Canada, we've worked very hard to win workplace protections and supports for people who experience domestic violence. There are domestic violence clauses in a lot of collective agreements, as well as the fact that we have prompted government and pushed government to ensure legislation in all provinces and territories dealing with domestic violence. In some, they have paid leave, in others, they have unpaid leave. But all of that work started long before we started the work to ratify the convention. So within the context of COVID-19, unions are responding to the widespread increase of domestic violence and violence and harassment experienced by frontline workers, particularly in highly feminized sectors such as healthcare, social care, domestic work, food and commercial industries, retail and cleaning sectors, and other operational sectors. And this further highlights the urgent need for all of us, every single country, to ratify C190.
Thank you for these examples from around the world. Let's turn now to a specific national campaign. It's already been mentioned several times. Next on our list is Carmen Brites. She is the Secretary of the Unión Personal Auxiliar de Casas Particulares in Argentina. She's also the Vice President of the International Domestic Workers Federation. Please note that Carmen is speaking in Spanish. If you are an English speaker, you must go to the menu at the bottom of the screen and select English to get interpretation. So, Carmen, Argentina has exciting news. Last week, it moved to ratify the ILO Violence and Harassment Convention and just has a few steps left to ratify this. How did you all achieve this success? Can you tell us how you approached this on the part of domestic workers?
Buenos días, buenas tardes a todas las compañeras y a los compañeros que nos están mirando y a mis queridas compañeras panelistas. Un honor estar con todas ellas. Muchas de ellas estuvieron los 3 años trabajando en el convenio 190, un convenio histórico, ¿no? Y un convenio donde fue dado después del convenio internacional 189, que era el convenio de las trabajadoras de casas particulares. No quiero dejar de decir cómo fue la lucha de las trabajadoras domésticas de todo el mundo, no solamente de Argentina, sino de todas las compañeras trabajadoras domésticas que estuvimos haciendo incidencia y que fue un eje importante del convenio 190 para su adopción con todos los países, haciendo incidencia con los estados, ¿no? Creo que este es un trabajo en equipo y un trabajo que la Federación viene haciendo, la Federación Internacional viene haciendo con todos sus afiliados desde antes de la adopción del convenio 190, porque veníamos con una experiencia importante del convenio 189, entonces sabíamos de qué manera nos debíamos mover dentro de este convenio internacional en Ginebra, estos 3 años de lucha por esta adopción de este convenio. Argentina fue uno de los incidentes desde la UPAC, desde la CGT y desde la CTA, donde compañeras de mucha lucha y de mucha inserción en sus sindicatos sobre temas de violencia, luchamos para que el Estado acompañe a este convenio, y así fue. Para nosotros fue una tremenda alegría poder haber tenido muchas coincidencias con el Estado argentino. Creo que nuestro sector es un sector que sufre todo tipo de violencia, ¿no? Es un sector que en muchas partes del mundo es un sector invisibilizado, y los sindicatos de trabajadoras de casas particulares también son invisibilizados por ser un sindicato de mujeres trabajadoras del hogar y por ser trabajadoras domésticas. Entonces, creo que fue un trabajo muy importante que cada una de nuestras organizaciones hizo para poder llegar a en Argentina a esta ratificación. Fuimos tomando espacios en cada lugar donde se hacían campañas contra la violencia, y también hay una voluntad política de nuestro presidente en haber ratificado este convenio en este proceso que ya falta muy poco para terminar, que es, como bien dijo Manuela y Marie Claire, es poner el documento en la OIT desde el Poder Ejecutivo. Y eso creo que va a pasar no muy lejos de este mes, seguramente vamos a tener ese tiempo para poder hacerlo. Pero creo que fue muy importante poder haber trabajado en todos los espacios como incidencia las trabajadoras de casas particulares. Nosotros trabajamos con la mesa de mujeres fuerza sindical, que también muchas compañeras de distintas organizaciones, de distintas actividades, lanzaban el empuje desde sus organizaciones para la ratificación. Trabajamos muchísimo y pertenecemos a la red intersindical de violencia, donde hay 103 gremios, sindicatos de todas las actividades que luchan constantemente y luchábamos constantemente para la ratificación de este convenio, pero todavía queda un largo proceso. Hoy ratificamos el convenio, pero este convenio va a ser una herramienta importante para el Estado y para los sindicatos y todas nuestras actividades para poder tener una ley nacional de protección sobre libre violencia y acoso en el mundo del trabajo en Argentina, y ojalá que esto se vaya dando en todos los países, que se vaya ratificando como fue el 189, pero la gran problemática que tenemos y la lucha que tenemos que seguir haciendo es que estos convenios que sean ratificados por los países se adopten dentro de nuestros países, se trabajen y se tomen como lo que son, un convenio internacional que dan derechos y que tienen fuerza de norma. que muchas veces se ratifican los convenios, pero queda como una letra muerta. Pero nosotros, los sindicatos, las de trabajadoras del hogar y todos los sindicatos de todas las actividades debemos empujar para que este convenio sea ley en cada uno de nuestros países.
Thank you so much. It's really inspiring to hear how domestic workers have entered the space working with different unions and pushed successfully for these international treaties. And we're looking forward to hearing about the next steps of implementation. Let's now move to India, where there is a national law against sexual harassment at work. We're so pleased to have Nandita Bhatt, Director of Operations from the Martha Farrell Foundation, joining us. Nandita, obviously legal reform is only the first step, but the true test is implementation. Can you describe India's sexual harassment law and what's happening in terms of implementation?
Sure. Thank you so much, Nisha, for having us. And so India's sexual harassment of women at workplace law was enacted in 2013. It is an important step in addressing gender-based discrimination and violence against women in the workplace. It recognizes that sexual harassment results in the violation of a woman's fundamental right to equality and protection of life and personal liberty. It is also the first ever legislation in India to recognize both formal and informal workers together and include domestic workers as employees in its language and positioning and definition, making it also the only legislation in the country to ensure the protection of domestic workers. But having said that, the term domestic worker features only 3 times in the entire law. The language in the many definitions used in the law do not seem entirely to reflect the reality of domestic workers. The law has failed to imagine the world of work of domestic workers, their multiple and invisible workplace, including that their employers are sometimes unknown and very powerful individuals. More than 80 domestic workers came together in Delhi for a Martha Farrell Foundation facilitated national consultation where they decoded the law. And so some of those discussions, some of these are from that discussion. But domestic workers, well, cannot be transferred to a different department, neither can they change their supervisor. It has imagined the perpetrators to be those from among other domestic workers and allied service providers. It is reflected in the suggested penalties and interim relief measures set forth in the law. The law mandates every employer to conduct awareness on the law and the reporting mechanism. However, in an action research by domestic workers along with Martha Farrell Foundation, found that all those who participated knew what was sexual harassment. All of them had experienced it in varying degrees and different points of their life, some even from the age of 10. But none of them knew about the law and the reporting mechanisms. The law mandates the formation of a local committee to address complaints of sexual harassment from informal women workers. They are mandated to provide time-bound justice to the complainant. However, the absence of such a redressal mechanism is stark. Only 191 among the 650 districts were found to have local committees in another study conducted by Martha Farrell Foundation. Additionally, while domestic workers can file a complaint like any other employee under the law, the lack of a time-enforced mechanism, partially due to the fact that the case of domestic workers are mandated under the law to be forwarded by these very same local committees to the police, deters these women from bringing forward their complaint. Law does not give the same rights of time-bound justice to domestic workers as it does for other women workers. The complaints will follow criminal procedures. The law is silent on the manner in which the monitoring and implementation of the law will also be conducted in the workplace of the domestic workers. Thank you, Nisha.
Thank you, Nandita. I'd also like to just take a moment to remind all of the audience members that if you have questions, you can send them through the online chat And we have moderators who are sending those questions to the panelists so that we can make the most of our time together. So now we'll turn to Ludovica Anada, the Gender Equality Advocacy Officer for CARE France. Unions, NGOs, and feminists have come together to urge France to ratify the ILO Violence and Harassment Convention and to make national reforms. Can you tell us more about how these groups have come together and what types of national reform you'd like to see?
Thank you very much for your question, Nisha, and for having me here. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We have indeed come together more specifically 2 years ago, in the first place, really to raise awareness about the convention and to urge the third government and employers to support the adoption of the convention at the ILO last year. And when I say we, I mean initially, in particular, my organization CARE France, together with ActionAid France and the French trade union CGT. And our joint mobilization has really grown since, and with a group of over 30 feminist associations, NGOs, and trade unions in France, we have launched together a petition and published an open letter to urge the French government to now ratify the convention, to even be the first country in Europe to ratify it, and to be a positive example for the protection of women's rights in the workplace. And we are very happy to hear, as announced by the Ambassador Delfino, the Generation Equality Forum will serve as a platform to promote the ratification of the convention. In France specifically, we know that over 30% of women are reported to be subject to harassment in the workplace. And it is estimated that 70% of women who have been victims of harassment in the workplace actually do not share it, as there is a widespread threat of negative repercussions, as was mentioned as well by previous speakers. And we know that 1 out of 3 countries in the world does not have any legislation that explicitly forbids harassment in the workplace. There is legislation in France on the issue, however, it is not sufficient and there is a need to ensure implementation. And what we ask in our mobilization is to go beyond simple ratification. We ask France to really take this as an opportunity to implement national reforms, to discuss and consult with the trade unions, with civil society, in order to identify the specific needs of workers, and also to see how the French legislation can evolve, be even more progressive and be truly effective to protect women and those who are most at risk of gender-based violence in the workplace. And in particular, we have 4 key recommendations in our mobilization for the French government. The first one is to build obligations for businesses to fight against violence in the workplace in France, but also abroad in their supply chains. And also to ensure that training and awareness raising is compulsory for all employees in different sectors and at different levels. The third recommendations is to protect all employees with an intersectional approach, with a particular attention to the groups that are most at risk of gender-based violence in the workplace. And this, for example, includes migrant workers, LGBTQI+ people, precarious workers. And last but not least, our fourth recommendation is to support victims and survivors of domestic violence, to address and tackle the impact that domestic violence has on their life. This was addressed also by previous speakers. This does not seem immediately obvious. Why should we speak of domestic violence if we are speaking of violence at work? But it is actually very important, for example, also because a victim of domestic violence that is, for example, trying to get away, to escape from her abuser, should not be forced to go to the workplace where he can easily find her. They might also need the time to recover, to undertake certain administrative or medical tasks, for example, to file their complaints, to do all the relevant follow-up. And as it was previously raised, this is, of course, particularly relevant right now at a time during this COVID-19 crisis where boundaries between home and the workplace are even less defined, and where women are in a lockdown with their abusers all over the world. And in line with our recommendation, we know that certain countries already have similar provisions to protect victims of domestic violence in the workplace. And For example, New Zealand provides 10 days of paid leave for domestic violence victims. In Spain, also gender-based violence victims and survivors have access to early retirement, suspension of their contract, working time reductions, among other measures. And thank you very much, Nisha.
Thank you so much, Ludovico. And I think this is a question that we will pick up further on what the French government is planning to do. But next, we're going to hear from Eunice Musime, the Executive Director from Akina Mama wa Africa, joining us from Uganda. Eunice, we've been hearing about domestic workers in India and Argentina, but we know that workers face violence and harassment in a wide range of sectors. Can you talk to us about flower farms in Uganda and what kind of measures you've been promoting to fight gender-based violence on these farms?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are. Yes, as Akina Mama wa Africa, we've been part of a campaign that was codenamed Women at Work campaign. It was a broader campaign focusing on promoting human rights or a rights-based approach in the horticulture sector in East and Southern Africa. Akina Mama wa Africa's role in this campaign was to advance women's leadership and influence at the workplace. But we took an intersectional feminist approach, so looking at women's strategic interests and women's practical needs. So in terms of women's strategic interests, we considered issues of a gender-responsive work environment, and that included looking at the laws, policies that were affecting women in the workplace. Sexual harassment is one of those that came up so many times. It was being addressed by different actors, but not enough from a feminist lens, with a feminist analysis, or with a feminist approach. I will give an example. There was awareness raising in terms of sexual harassment or in terms of violence, but a lot of time there was victim blaming as well. So issues of, oh no, you shouldn't wear such a short skirt. You should stay in a lit place. So there was that lack of a feminist analysis in the approaches that were being promoted. So beyond looking at a gender responsive environment, we also focused on ensuring that there were laws and policies at the workplace that could protect women, could prevent and protect women. So we worked with different actors to ensure that there was a model sexual harassment policy that different flower farms could also adopt and adapt to their environment. We also worked with duty bearers in the flower farms, so looking at human resource officers, first to raise consciousness about the issues that were affecting women in the flower farms, to raise their own consciousness about sexual harassment. At the beginning of the project, we had human resource officers saying, oh, you know, the women come to me offering sexual favors, and we had to be able to address that and say, address the root cause of sexual harassment, which is really economic and political disparities and equal power relations. So looking at all those from a feminist approach. We also did work that would not only link flower farm, link to other allies, like you've talked about domestic workers, workers in the informal sector, workers that work in markets, so that we begin to build a movement that would address issues of violence and harassment in the world of work. Akina Mama's specialty is women's leadership development. So we also focused on developing the leadership of women so that they can be able to challenge some of these practices in the flower farm. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Eunice. And I'll just make a note here that there's some really great resources that Eunice has sent, that other panelists have sent about their work with a lot of these concrete examples and models. We will be sending all of these resources to you afterwards, and we're also saving the chat. So we hope that you all take a look at those. So last but not least, we're going to turn to Hida Anani, founder and director of Abad Lebanon. 2020 has been an extraordinarily tough year, and women in Lebanon are dealing with concurrent crises. For example, the Beirut blast, political uncertainty, the COVID pandemic. With all of this going on, how do you keep a spotlight on gender-based violence at work and integrate it into crisis response?
Thank you so much, Nisha, and thank you for this actually much important question. The situation in Lebanon, I guess, and in the MENA region has been quite unique on many levels. And keeping the agenda of gender equality and women's rights and protection in general has been quite challenging, but yet I would say not impossible. And that only by adopting what I like to call like the equation of 3 Ps, which is the power of numbers, keeping like really in the forefront the numbers of people being affected by sexual harassment and sexual violence, gender-based violence, domestic violence in general, the number of survivors, the number of women calling for support, the number of women who have lost their lives because of incidents of violence or femicide, keeping like in the radar and in the discourse, in the media, in the reports, in the public communication, the figures and how what is the magnitude of the problem and how this is impacting women and girls that are always the most vulnerable in any kind of emergency, being a natural disaster or being a man-made emergency, or being like situations uncontrollable or health situation. This is number one in like really keeping an eye and keeping track and keep communicating the numbers and figures. Secondly, which is the power of voice, the voice of right holders themselves. As much as we're keeping the voice of women like really heard despite even the lockdown, through campaigning, through published stories, through mobilizations and activations, really keeping like the people concerned themselves communicating about how much this is affecting their well-being, how much this is affecting their lives in general. And thirdly, which is the power of evidence. And here, like really showing how much is the cost of gender-based violence on the life of women themselves, but also in its intersectional, like, dimension, meaning how much it's interrelated with other factors, with poverty, with health, but also with different sectors in the response, and how if we are like keeping and addressing protection concerns, this can be like for the sake of the entire society, different sectors, and how much this is effective, especially when we're talking about sexual harassment in the workplace, and we're in the era of COVID. Sometimes, and for most of the time, actually, women are working from homes, and also like there's a lot of engagement from female workers in different life-saving sectors like the health. In Beirut, in the response to the blast, the female volunteers were the one taking care of all the implications because of the failure of the state systems. So here, like talking about sexual harassment and protection in the workplace has really became like a kind of concern for everyone. And this what make it like really possible to keep it on the level of advocacy and pushing things forward despite all odds, I would say. Thank you, Nisha.
Thank you so much. It's really great to hear from all corners of the world the way that pressure is building up to promote these standards. And I think some reference was made to how the pandemic has slowed things, but I think most of you will agree with me that it's really inspiring to hear how much concrete work is being done by so many people in so many different countries. And it makes me feel very hopeful for 2021. All right, so next what we're going to do is we're going to have one more round of questions, and I'm going to ask our panelists to have this be sort of a lightning round so that we can leave time for audience Q&A at the end. So let me get right to it. So let me request you to try to cut down your responses to about 2 minutes each. Okay, so Manuela, support for survivors, accountability for perpetrators is essential, but we really want to prevent gender-based violence in the first place. Can you talk about steps that governments and businesses should be taking in terms of prevention?
Yes, well, that's a very good question. Of course, to prevent gender-based violence, it is important to build inclusive and supportive workplaces that nurture mutual respect and dignity and make it clear that gender-based violence or any other form of violence will not be tolerated. The convention and the recommendation provide some useful guidance in this respect. And they say very clearly that there is no single measure that will do the trick in terms of prevention, but that there is a need for a battery of mutually reinforcing measures. For instance, I mean, the Convention 190 and the Recommendation 206 require member states to adopt laws that would require employers to adopt workplace policies that need to do a number of things, among others, define and prohibit gender-based violence or violence and harassment more generally, spell out what are the responsibilities of employers and workers, explain how the privacy of the persons involved will be protected, and how complainants or victims will be shielded against victimization or retaliation. The convention also provides for employers' duty to conduct risk assessments that identify the factors that may contribute to workplace harassment and violence. And these risk factors may comprise, for instance, very poor communication concerning tasks and expectations by management, working with third parties or with people in distress, or working in remote locations or at night, as well as discrimination and abuse of power relation. Other very important supplementary devices to prevent gender-based violence include, as it has already been mentioned by a number of the previous speakers, the supply of information and training in ways that are accessible to workers, to managers, and other persons concerned. Periodic confidential employee surveys that take the pulse of the situation and help evaluate the effectiveness of the measures put in place could also be a very important device. And now coming, to specifically to state what they can do. I mean, besides requiring employees to keep workplaces free from violence and harassment, they can, as it has already been mentioned earlier on, collect and publish statistics on violence and harassment, disaggregated by sex, by the form of violence and harassment, by sector or economic activity, because this is absolutely key to orienting public policies, to set priorities and catalyzing public attention through public campaigns. This is particularly useful in countries that may be facing some also serious constraints. So knowing what is the magnitude of the phenomenon, where it is concentrating, which type of women or individuals are particularly affected by it and why, is absolutely key to indeed contributing to creating safe, healthy, and harmonious workplaces free from violence and harassment. Thank you.
Thank you. So turning now to Delphine O. Ludovica talked about the demands of the French civil society and trade unions, and France was a strong supporter of the convention, what can you tell us about a timeline for the government's ratification? And in particular, what types of national reforms would accompany that? For example, she also raised the example of legislation around domestic violence survivors. So can you speak to that question?
Sure, thank you. So this is almost a direct answer to my colleague Ludovica from CARE. So I can say, just like other countries, the timeline for the ratification was a little bit postponed and delayed because of the pandemic. It was actually quite on track in the beginning of this year before the pandemic hit us. But I hear from my colleagues in the Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that it's definitely back on track. And I do hope, and I think the Generation Equality Forum is also there to push our colleagues from different ministries, that it will definitely be ratified when we reach the Generation Equality Forum in June of 2021, even though again, the parliamentary agenda is very busy, also because of the regulations, the health regulations, but we do very much hope to be ratifying before the forum. We also hope to be sort of at the forefront of a general dynamic, which includes also some of our European colleagues, because obviously this is also something, sort of fight against gender-based violence and sexual harassment that is also being considered at the level of the European Union. I hear that some of our close neighbors, Italy and Spain and Finland, have already expressed interest in ratification, and we do hope to be working at the European level also to maintain this dynamic. I would also say that, would also note that France has reached its fifth cooperation agreement with ILO, which goes from 2020 to 2024. And I'm happy to say that among the 4 issues that this cooperation agreement covers, one of them is specifically targeting gender-based violence and sexual harassment and gender equality. And in the context of this cooperation agreement, which was relaunched in the summer, France will provide technical help for ratification among some African countries. So this is a specific budget that is being invested by the Ministry of Labor in terms of cooperating with some specific African countries. And I've heard before from Uganda, I heard, I think also from Namibia, that have already expressed interest in ratification. I also would like to say that there is strong support from the French private sector. There was support in the process for the adoption. There was an op-ed that was signed by the 5 CEOs of 5 major French companies, including BNP and L'Oréal and other French companies that we're working with in the context of the Generation Equality Forum. And I know that we'll be collaborating with us in order to make sure that we ratify on time. In terms of national law, I cannot really speak to that because this is the domain of the Ministry of Labor. I just wanted to remind the public that, of course, sexual harassment and sexual violence is already punished by law in the French law, but we also adopted a new law in 2018 that has sort of strengthened the penal code when it comes to sexual harassment, and especially expands the perimeter of what is being punished by law from sexual language to also sexist language. So the use of sexist language is considered as sexual harassment in the workplace, and also tries to expand the definition to cyber harassment, because we've seen a very concerning surge in cyber harassment against women in the workplace or not in the workplace, also in the general public, because of the pandemic. This area tended to be overlooked by the authorities. So we tried with the 2018 law to also cover this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's very helpful to get a perspective from a government. Now I'm going to turn to Marie Clark Walker. You have a global perspective on this, and it's kind of the million-dollar question, but what are the top challenges to widespread ratification? Do you have thoughts on how that can be addressed?
Thanks, Nisha. So in the interest of time, let me just go through a couple of things and just let people know that ratification, we know that ratification takes time because there are several steps to ratification, and there are those challenges. So There are challenges to governments. Governments may be hesitant because it will require them to align their national laws and policies with the provisions of the convention. For those whose national laws or policies need considerable work, this is a bigger hurdle, obviously, than those who already have things in place, or they may face some barriers getting agreement from other levels of government, which they would require in order to ratify. And this is the situation that we find ourselves in Canada at this point. Some governments may also have changed hands since the negotiations, and we've seen the rise of governments that are right-wing populist governments that may not want to see a convention like this ratified. So those things make our work a lot harder. Employers also may not want to commit to 190 because it addresses some specific responsibilities that they have to prevent and address violence and harassment. And indeed, many employers resist the very notion of employment regulation and can also be very powerful influencers in government policy. The advantage that we have is that there was a broad consensus that was built during the negotiations. And while we see commitments growing among governments to ratify C190, we need to do a lot more work to build the momentum. Unions definitely play a critical role in the process. They engage in social dialogue and tripartite meetings. They lobby their governments. We put arguments forward with respect to the importance of ratifying C190, and we make recommendations with respect to implementation. We also are able to put things through the collective bargaining process, and we've been able to work with some employers to include C90 language and provisions in their policies as well. All of this is an important step. If it protects workers in their workplace, and it lays a groundwork for governments to ratify and implement 190. Public lobby is also important, and advocacy campaigns that build a critical public support and critical mass that's needed to convince governments to ratify C190. And we've already discussed some examples, but I want to underscore the importance of sharing workers' stories in terms of building support. Decision makers and the general public need to understand the tangible difference that this convention can make in the lives of workers. And they need to understand the extent of the problem in terms of who it affects and the different ways that it affects different people. The stories about the provisions of the convention and recommendations can definitely help, because these stories are grounded in best practices, and they show that we can, if we really want to do so, we can make work much safer for people. Civil society organizations and supporters of the convention are also important partners in ratifying C190, and we encourage our allies to work with unions at the national level to help build awareness about the importance of C190 and the ratification of this very, very important convention. Somebody asked about education. Again, education at all levels, extremely important. Thank you, Nisha.
Thanks. So I'm now going to turn to Carmen, and we have the Domestic Workers Convention from 2011, and there is so much, I think, experience and lessons learned from that. Can you share some of those with us, especially as we engage in this work in promoting C190 as well?
Bueno, como saben ustedes, las trabajadoras domésticas, trabajadoras de casas particulares, trabajadoras del hogar, como dice nuestro convenio 189, sufren todo tipo de violencia. No solamente la violencia laboral, sino también la violencia intrafamiliar, ¿no? La mayoría de nuestras compañeras vienen con situaciones también desde sus familias, de que viven con violentos, y esas trabajadoras no solamente sufren el tema de la violencia laboral, sino también la intrafamiliar. El gran problema que tenemos las trabajadoras de casas particulares es la invisibilización del trabajo como no visto como un trabajo, como cualquier otro trabajador o otra actividad. Y esto no solamente pasa acá en Argentina, sino a nivel mundial, porque en Argentina tenemos 1.400.000 trabajadoras no registradas todavía, a pesar de tener una ley protectora, a pesar de haber conseguido muchos derechos, todavía se vulneran los derechos de las trabajadoras, porque no se la considera una trabajadora. Es invisible todavía para el empleador mirar a las trabajadoras domésticas como una trabajadora. Desde nuestra organización, desde UPAC, y a nivel latinoamericano y a nivel mundial, la Federación ha apoyado a las compañeras para la capacitación de campañas en redes sociales. Utilizamos todos los medios, televisión, radio, para poder trabajar y visibilizar y jerarquizar el trabajo doméstico. No solamente para llegar a una registración y modificar las leyes que tenemos dentro de nuestros países, para que todas las trabajadoras del mundo tengan el derecho a tener la seguridad social, a tener un salario digno. Y desde Argentina hemos trabajado muchísimo en un diálogo social y en campañas con distintos sectores de los ministerios, con ministerios de la mujer nacional y provincial, con Ministerio de Trabajo, con Ministerio de Educación. Desde nuestra organización tenemos más de 22 escuelas de capacitación para trabajadoras de casas particulares. Y como dijo Mary Claire, que fue, para mí fue muy importante su palabra, es que dentro de nuestra organización nosotros aspiramos que las trabajadoras de casas particulares sean capacitadas y que sean trabajadores por necesidad, que sean trabajadoras no por necesidad, sino por elección, que esa trabajadora tenga la opción del día de mañana poder jerarquizar su trabajo, poder capacitarse, y si, ¿por qué no? Si ella quiere llegar a tener la opción, como cualquier otro trabajador, de tener la educación primaria, secundaria y por qué no universitaria, que sea una elección de esa trabajadora poder seguir avanzando en la vida. Y esa es una forma de reconocer el trabajo doméstico como un trabajo también. Pero no solamente nos cuesta que acepten que las trabajadoras de casas particulares, trabajadoras domésticas o trabajadoras del hogar sufren violencia, sino que también somos un sector del cuidado, un sector que tiene que ser reconocido como un sector del cuidado. Nosotros cuidamos a sus familias, cuidamos a sus hijos, cuidamos sus casas, cuidamos a sus adultos, por lo cual en Argentina es una política pública, no solamente el tema de violencia, que está en agenda desde el Estado, en todos nuestros sindicatos y en todos nuestros ministerios, municipios, intendencias, sino también el tema del cuidado. Y desde ahí partimos con diferentes tipos de campañas. Y desde la organización sindical nuestra, UPAC, lo que hacemos es visibilizar y jerarquizar todo el tiempo el trabajo. ¿Cómo? En este momento estamos elaborando una aplicación que estamos muy apoyadas en Argentina por OIT, por ATRAP de Ginebra, por OIT Ginebra, sobre todo lo que tenga que ver sobre visibilización del trabajo doméstico y jerarquización. Por eso es que hay que seguir trabajando con cada uno de nuestros organismos, no solamente nacionales, sino también internacionales, y el apoyo que la Federación Internacional de Trabajadoras del Hogar le da a cada uno de sus afiliados en esto de capacitarnos, hacernos mejores líderes para poder el día de mañana tomar mejores decisiones. Y esto fue lo que hizo la organización internacional, es capacitarnos antes de llegar a la convención, no solamente del 189, sino también del 190. Y a partir de ahí creemos que las trabajadoras domésticas con muy poco, porque nosotros somos organizaciones sindicales y que representamos a millones de trabajadoras y tenemos la voz de las trabajadoras domésticas, que prácticamente no tenemos sustentabilidad, pero sí tenemos la fuerza y la energía para la lucha, y por eso es que Latinoamérica llevó en el convenio 189 16 ratificaciones y estamos modificando los derechos de las trabajadoras domésticas en el mundo entero. Estamos obteniendo derechos, no beneficios, porque los beneficios vienen primero los derechos y después todos los beneficios que podamos obtener cada uno de nuestros países para las trabajadoras domésticas. Pero nosotros, a nivel internacional, somos una voz única, somos la voz de las trabajadoras domésticas, pero en trabajo de unidad y con mucha fuerza para seguir luchando por los derechos de las trabajadoras. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I think it really underlines the importance of the recognition of domestic work as work, and also the ways to support workers, to be organizers, the ability to have trainings. So thank you for that. We have about 10 minutes left in the session. So I do want to get to the next, the remaining speakers, and to really encourage all of you to use the online chat. We have a great discussion there, and it is a way to get your questions answered. So Nandita, just continuing on this theme of implementation, can you talk about the next steps needed so that workers in India are able to get real protection from the sexual harassment law? What are the political pressure points?
All right, thank you, Nisha. You know, sexual harassment at workplace is one of the most underreported forms of violence. There is just no data. So the lack of data and the lack of reporting is very telling. And the fact that there are no redressal mechanisms and no implementation, or the lack of implementation, is also very telling on the will, or the political will, to actually address these issues. The Human Rights Watch has also recently, last month, taken out a report on this, and previously domestic workers that we have been working with have also produced an action-based research, which was an arts-based research, really on with a sari depicting experiences of sexual harassment that they have experienced in their world of work. And they use this piece of artwork. It's in the film that we will be sharing in a little while in the chat box, but it is this piece of sari that that domestic workers used to actually negotiate with the government of Delhi to ask them for the implementation of the law. So what a lesson drawn from this was that the voices and the stories of survivors of domestic workplace harassment of domestic workers is absolutely absent. So there is a need to create such platforms and to create avenues for women workers to be able to express. Having said that, though the laws that we have are for redressal and protection and prohibition of sexual harassment for the women worker, but having said that, now that we have a law, the approach is more process oriented than survivor centric. That is a big challenge that we have currently. And the national call for action that the domestic workers, and the unions and the civil society organization, when they came together, we formed a national call for action for the implementation of the law. And a lot of issues were discussed in that. One was that the law, the language that is used in the law, the kind of redressal mechanisms that are there, that are mentioned in the law, do not really cater to all, both the informal and the formal sector. So very small things such as, the law, requires that there must be an internal committee in every workplace, in the formal workplace. But that is just a tick box. Do internal committees really exist? Are they on paper? Are they functioning? Have they been trained? And internal committee workers are members are also actually employees from the same workplace. So have we been able to address that challenge as well? The biggest challenge that we feel right now is the language and the approach to the issue and the implementation of the law it is not survivor centric. We don't talk about knowing your rights. It's more about filling a tick box and really complying with the law, because the compliance mechanism asks that there be training every year. It asks that a committee be formed. It asks that it be trained. But who is monitoring it? Who is implementing it? So especially when it comes to in the formal workplace, it might be possible, but when it comes to informal workers, who is actually going to implement that? How is that woman working in a brick kiln in a small little town in central India going to travel to hundreds and thousands of miles to the redressal mechanism to actually file a complaint? Who is going to support her? Where is the mechanism to support informal workers to actually file a complaint? Who is going to help them write the complaint? Who is going to decode decode the law for them? Who is going to tell them that this is unlawful and you have the right to actually file a complaint? So the time now is that we start collectivizing civil society. So we have begun that during COVID. Civil society organizations, unions, and domestic workers have come together. We formed a little alliance, and we are focusing on raising awareness and pushing for the implementation of this law. So the Human Rights Watch report was very, very timely. It supported us in the work that we are doing, and it has been able to raise the issues, that we were already talking about to a larger audience. So I think the time is now that we all, so when we talk about the Me Too campaign, we have a For My Me Too, because if you look at it, in the Me Too, it is largely digital. It was on the digital platform. So informal workers and domestic workers really who did not have access to digital technology were not part of the for the Me Too campaign. So how do those voices come out? How do we enable women who don't have access to such technologies to actually influence policy making and implementation of laws? So that is the focus that we have been in. And I think, engage research, encouraging voices to be heard and enabling a safe environment for them when they do voice, when they do choose to voice, is something that needs to be focused right now. So
thank you. Thank you, Nandita. I think those are really critical points, and to think about how solidarity is extended and the types of platforms and spaces that are created so that it's inclusive. All right, I note that we have 5 minutes left. We have one of our panelists, Alice Bordesar, who has been waiting very patiently for your opportunity to speak. So thank you. We've been talking a lot about the role of governments. Can you talk about the engagement of businesses and what you think their priorities should be, in particular those of multinational companies?
Thank you very much, Nisha and Human Rights Watch for inviting me today to speak among all these impressive speakers. I'm going to speak about the situation in global supply chains and what multinational companies should or could do. As you know, women are predominantly employed in precarious, low-skilled and low-paid jobs worldwide. For example, they make up 80% of the workforce in global garment supply chains, or in the toy industry in China. And violence and harassment are rampant in those sectors. For example, in a recent ActionAid International survey of the Bangladesh garment sector, 80% of the women workers surveyed said they've been victims or witnessed sexual harassment. And in agriculture, as Eunice mentioned, for flour, I have numbers for tea plantations, more than 90% of women working have been victims or witnesses sexual or physical abuse in the fields. And multinational companies have a responsibility in this terrible situation. For example, imposing very short production times and great flexibility puts enormous pressure on wages and working conditions. And other factors, such as the use of precarious contracts, subordinations of women mainly for men male, union discrimination, increase the risk of gender-based violence. And I heard Ambassador Delphine O mentioning that few French multinational companies are doing, or what they are communicating at least. But we see, unfortunately, is that multinational companies don't act much to change the situation. In France, we have the law on duty of vigilance, which makes compulsory for large French companies to establish and implement a diligence plan, which should state the measures taken to identify and prevent violations of human rights resulting from their activities, the activities of companies they control, and the activities of subcontractors and suppliers. But companies don't take a gender approach when they do their plan, when they do it, and they forget specific risks for women workers, such as sexual harassment. And according to Article 9 of the ILO Convention, each member shall adopt laws and regulations requiring employers to take appropriate steps commensurate with their degree of control to prevent violence and harassment. And we think that an interpretation consistent with the spirit of the convention should lead the northern countries to ratify ILO Convention 190, requiring companies to address sexual violence throughout their supply chains, including in other countries. And what companies should do is adopt and implement a workplace policy on violence and harassment applicable in their whole supply chain, take into account violence and harassment in the management of occupational safety and health, identify hazards and assess the risk of violence and harassment in their supply chains and take measures to prevent and control them, and provide to workers and other persons concerned information and training in accessible formats, depending on the country. So what's written in Article 9, it has to be implemented in all their activities. And companies should mitigate risk factors often leading to gender-based violence that I mentioned before, like precarious contract, very short production lead times, and pressures on suppliers to reduce prices. And we think ratification of the ILO Convention 190 is a great opportunity to remind to multinationals company that women's rights are human rights and that they have to fight against gender-based violence in all their activities. And we hope other countries will consider the possibility to regulate companies and ask them to fight against gender-based violence in their activities abroad as well. And thank you very much for your attention, and many thanks to the interpreters as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I note that we are at 10:30 and that several people will have to go. I want to have a chance for our two remaining speakers to go. I think we may not be able to have interpretation for the next few minutes. We'll just see, but I'll just go ahead right until 10:30. Eunice, many people are familiar with the Me Too movement, but not as familiar with the mobilization around the Violence and Harassment Convention. Can you talk about how these are connected or thoughts from the conversation we had today?
Okay, thank you, Nisha. Yes, I would say that, as noted earlier by Manuela, mobilization for the convention was quite difficult, mainly because while people recognize the significance of the issue that we're facing, many needed data. So the Me Too movement helped to bring to the fore the fact that despite women having power, having security, having influence in spaces like the media, they were still facing violence and harassment. And that really highlighted the fact that then what happens to garment workers, what happens to women in the informal sector, women who work in the market sector, all that. So it helped to cement the need for a binding treaty on violence and sexual harassment. It also helped to highlight the need for an intersectional feminist approach, because it showed that this is being faced by across the board. It wasn't an issue for one group and not the other. So the Me Too movement and also efforts around Convention 190 have shown us that this is not an issue for one single sector. This is an issue that we need to come together and organize together. It has also showed that the root cause of violence and harassment in the world of work are structure, so issues of sexism, racism, capitalism, imperialism, homophobia, heterosexism, so all the isms that we can think of, all those systems of oppression are the root cause, and therefore violence and harassment is simply a symptom of the structural inequalities. And going forward, that's what is needed in terms of closing the gap between implementation. The chat group has shown many are asking, yes, it's great to have a law, but how do we close the gap? So closing the gap will also require us to address the root causes, the structural causes of inequality that are underlying violence and harassment in the world of work. I just want to quickly say something that has not been quite highlighted, issues of survival-centric approaches. One of the things we've seen of creating healing spaces for survivors to come together. Not all survivors probably want to go through the court system. Maybe they just want to be heard. They want to be heard in a safe, in a bold space. So creating spaces where survivors can come together, find healing, access psychosocial support is also critical. And then of course, creating funds like Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. We've also found that making available access to legal aid or to defense funds is going to help in terms of increasing the numbers and ending the impunity. And finally, I would say that we need to find ways of mitigating the risks of survivors coming out. Many survivors, once they come out, then they face the shame, the double victimization, the loss of esteem, never being able to get jobs. So all that needs to be mitigated through alternatives that can help survivors come out and speak out on violence and harassment. Thank you.
Thank you, Eunice. I think those are absolutely essential points, particularly the point about survivor-centered approaches and spaces and resources. So thank you for highlighting that. Just to say thank you for those of you who are able to stay on for a few extra minutes. I see that many of you have stayed on while we wrap up. And so quickly, I'd like to turn to Hida to ask you the same question. You know, the Me Too movement mobilized millions to take risks, speak out, demand change. But now, you know, that vibrant and we've been hearing in this seminar about how many have been working years, you know, for these changes. How do we connect that with sometimes the kind of long and bureaucratic campaigns to get legal change and to see the implementation happen?
Well, I would say basically it's the most important is this kind of building blocks, like the cumulative work, especially that there is a like kind of some momentums that we can pick on and build upon in a way where like really where we're able to push some kind of concrete tangible results, which is quite difficult nowadays, and in our context, especially in the Middle East. And you know, currently we're in a kind of very much of transitional kind of the entire schema, the entire situation. But I would say such movement, like even it allowed us in Lebanon, the Me Too itself, to push for abolishing a very shameful article that was in our penal code, the Lebanese penal code, which was related to marrying your rapist, which was an article allowing the rapist in case of marrying the victim to escape punishment. And it was an article like the Article 522, where we were able at the very beginning to build on Me Too movement, the campaign, to have like mobilization of women speaking up, and then showcasing real evidence situation and the cost on the life of women, especially like in Lebanon, even abortion is illegal. So imagine if you are even like, you know, pregnant from the rapist and you're not allowed to even let go on the baby, you don't have a decision over your body. And all these kind of situation put the women in more and more harmful and risky life-saving situation. So, for me, like such movement can allow like picking on very specific change that you would like to see, as much as we're meticulous in pointing to being able to identify a change in a sense that is achievable, measurable, but also like not too ambitious, and unfolding one article after the other. I think it's possible if we have like this kind of tactic, rather than calling upon like a change in a dogma, like in a big, an entire chapter or an entire full legislation.
Thanks. I think that is, you know, really sensible tactics, you know, concrete change, incremental that we see that we can achieve. So thanks. There's so much to learn from different campaigns. Okay, so while we wrap up, we are just going to have two brief announcements. One is from our co-sponsors, the Global 16 Days campaign. As many of you on this call already know, we are soon about to embark on the 16 days of activism. So Ardra, are you able to jump in to speak about the campaign? Okay, we can't hear you yet. We will share the campaign link. I'll make one last announcement until hopefully you can speak, which is that Human Rights Watch will be launching a global campaign starting next week. We will send you all information about this, but over 2021 and longer, we really hope to help harness a global audience to support national campaigns. And again, with this idea of specific, very specific demands and as Hidda was saying, achievable, incremental steps. So please keep your eyes open for that we are really hoping now to keep the momentum going. I've been really inspired to hear about, the incredible work going on by so many incredible people around the world. And let's, turn this into real changes in people's lives. So I'm just going to check with Ardra one more time if you're able to speak on behalf of the 16 Days campaign. All right. Well, they have launched, their campaign. Many of you can go to social media to see it. We are also posting the links in the chat. It's really exciting. As many of you know, 16 Days is November 25th to December 10th. And this toolkit is provided. So we hope to see you all in that virtual space as well. And I will close here. Thank you for staying on. Those of you who stayed on till now, thank you for joining this conversation. It's been a real pleasure. A special thanks to our panelists, a special thanks to our interpreters, a special thanks particularly to my colleagues Erica and Suze, who have been running the show backstage. Wishing you all to be well, to be safe, and I look very much to staying in touch. Thank you all so much.